Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our thoughts for this Palm Sunday. We've become acclimatised to seeing people demonstrating about all kinds of things. Perhaps even at different times we may have found ourselves caught up in them. But of course, demonstrations are no new thing. And I think there's an element in which it's used to express one's opinion. It's been said that the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem during that last week of his life was an emotional demonstration. Jesus couldn't have chosen a more dramatic moment, for it was into a city crowded with people keyed up with religious expectations that he came. The people were there for the festival of the Passover. They were expecting God to raise up a king to deliver them from the power of the Romans. And yet Jesus rode into Jerusalem as a very different kind of king. And of course, this took courage because he knew that it would eventually lead to his death. Christ is an example of courage to us. Through his life and ministry, we see time and time again the courage of Jesus. And it would seem that his courage comes to the fore every time he's faced with hostility, either from the crowds or the opposition from Jewish religious leaders. But perhaps his courage is most noticeable when we realise that Jesus actually knew the way that lay ahead of him. He knew everything that was going to be put before him. He knew of the awfulness of the time that would come when everyone, including his Father, would desert him. And yet he still had the courage to carry out the commitment of his task. There's a courage that comes at the impulse of the moment, a courage which comes to a life in a sudden emergency, when actually there's no time to think, and in which a person becomes a hero by an instinctive reaction. But of course, a higher courage is that which comes when a person has had time to think and see clearly the things that lie ahead, and yet having counted the cost, still goes on. And this, of course, is the courage that Jesus had. Jesus knew he was entering a hostile city. However enthusiastic the crowds were, the authorities hated him. They'd sworn to eliminate him. He could have evaded this kind of entry and slipped into the city under the cover of darkness. But Jesus deliberately sets himself at the centre of the stage when every eye would be upon him. Prior to this, of course, as we've seen recently, Jesus had kept his messianic claim quiet. He'd stopped the evil spirits proclaiming his messiahship. But now, in effect, he was throwing down the gauntlet, and here was a deliberate challenge to the authorities to do their worst. In Zechariah 9 verse 9 we read, "See, your king comes, triumphant and victorious, but humble and riding on a donkey." Jesus' action here was one of great courage. This was a deliberate messianic claim, and it took tremendous courage when remembering Jerusalem was crowded with Jews who would recognise what he was stating. Jesus was offering himself to the people as the Anointed One. He was claiming his kingship, a kingship of the heart. And through this courage came a last invitation to people to open up their hearts to him. But we see not only his courage on this day, we also see his humility. Jesus had many channels open to him to claim his messiahship, and yet he chose to do it through meekness and humility. All through his life, Jesus had shown humility. His birth was in the humble surroundings of a stable, and Paul, later writing to the Corinthians, spoke of him, "Though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich." In John 13, we have the account of Jesus humbling himself before the disciples, washing their feet, proving himself to be the willing servant of all. And if Isaiah 53 is speaking of the promised Messiah as is widely believed, this too shows his humility. Finally, he took upon himself the form of a servant and was made in the likeness of men. He humbled himself and became obedient to death, the death on the cross. In humility, Jesus was obedient. He condescended to ride a donkey as a mark of obedience and humility. Now, in the Western world, a donkey would often be regarded as a despised animal. And yet, to some degree in the East, it was also seen as a noble animal. We know that in war, a king would ride a horse. And yet riding a donkey indicated that he came in peace. So when Jesus claimed to be king, it was a king of peace. William Barclay said, "He showed that he came not to destroy but to love, not to condemn but to help, not in the might of arms, but in the strength of love." Jesus appeared in meekness. He was to suffer injury and indignity for our sake. But also we recognise that through this, Christ is honoured. Micah chapter 6 and verse 8 says, "What the Lord requires of us is this, to do what is just, to show constant love, and to live in humble fellowship with God." Now, each one of us is required to be obedient to God's will for our lives, whatever that may be. To be able to deal with whatever God asks of us means that we must respond with a total commitment. That inward feeling matched by an outward action. And right from his childhood, Jesus had been committed to his task. As a young boy of 12, we read how he was aware of his task when he spoke about being about his Father's business. He was committed to his task to the point of death. His commitment came through his obedience. He was always aware of the need for obedience, both for himself and for his followers. And in a few days' time, we will remind ourselves of the fact that there were times when Jesus felt it was all too much. The scenes in Gethsemane, when he asks for that cup to be taken away from him, and yet he says, "Yet not my will, but yours be done." Jesus is the supreme example of commitment, for his commitment led to his death. He knew what was to come and still set his face toward Jerusalem. Jesus showed his example of great courage. Well, we've seen many examples of the courage of Jesus. We've seen the courage of other Christians too, who have faced great opposition in their witness. But what's our courage like? Are we prepared to stand up for what we believe in? Are we prepared to stand up for Christ? Well, we can emulate him by drawing on his strength. Jesus said that the poor in spirit are those who will be blessed. James and John didn't show humility when they fought over who would have the best position in the kingdom of God. But Jesus showed his humility when he lifted the towel as he washed the disciples' feet. And of course, Jesus has to use us. And just as he needed the disciples then, so he needs us today. He can use us all, even with our failings, if we allow ourselves to be used by him. He was fully committed, and so must we be. He proved in the past and is proving today that he can use all those who allow themselves to be used. He used the donkey, the fishermen, the tax collectors. He used ordinary people and illustrated his teaching with ordinary things. The donkey didn't know how and why it was being used, and sometimes it's like that for us. We don't always know how and if God is using us. But once we've placed ourselves at his disposal, we must then commit ourselves to serve him with courage and humility, knowing that he is with us and that he has gone before us. Those who take Christ as their King must place their all at his feet. May God bless you during this coming Holy Week as we consider so many different things of that event. Take care. See you soon.